hi everyone, and welcome to this special webinar on effective retrospectives in the age of coronavirus. I'm David Horowitz, CEO and co-founder at Retrium, a platform that helps distributed Agile teams run better retrospectives, and I'll be your moderator today. First, I want to thank Retrium's co-organizer, the Agile Alliance, for helping us put together such a fantastic group of panelists. I also want to thank all of you who submitted questions for the panel discussion. I've done my best to distill your questions down to the ones that either applied to the widest audience or were upvoted the most. Before we start, given what's going on in the world today, I wanted to say a few words about why we are hosting a webinar on retrospectives. Imagine for a moment that you were brand new to Agile and didn't know anything about putting Agile into practice, except that you were lucky enough to know how to facilitate highly effective retrospectives. Through these retrospectives, your team could discover many things. For example, the value of short iterations and constant customer feedback, the importance of cross-functional teams, and how prioritizing your backlog can help deliver the right value to your customers. In fact, through retrospectives, your team could discover everything it needs to know about agility. And that's why retrospectives are so important. If agility is all about continuous improvement, then it's the retrospective that catalyzes your team's continuous improvement process. And in today's world, retrospectives are even more important than normal because they give you the opportunity to press pause on the uncertainty and volatility around you. And while you're pressing pause, they give you permission to ask what's working and what's not working and what could we do right now that would make things just a bit better. And with all of that in mind, I could not be more thrilled to moderate this panel discussion today with some of the world's leading experts on effective retrospectives. My hope is that at the conclusion of this webinar, you will have learned at least one thing that you can use to improve your retrospectives right away. Now, a few housekeeping notes before we jump in. During the panel discussion, many of you will have questions. I encourage you to submit these questions through the Zoom Q&A interface. To do so, simply move your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window and click Q&A. It's unlikely that we will have the chance to address these questions during the webinar today, but the panelists have graciously agreed to answer your questions in a follow-up blog post in the near future. Finally, we are recording this webinar, and we will make it available to watch online as soon as possible. And now I'd like to give each of our expert panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves. In no particular order, let's start with Diana.
Oh, no particular order. I was the last one. I thought you'd start. Hi, I'm Diana Larsen. I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon, and I am currently co-founder of the Agile Fluency Project. And my lifelong interest has been learning in groups, which is why I've contributed what I've contributed to the Agile community. And Esther.
I'm Esther Derby. I live in northern Minnesota where the interstate highway ends. I am, along with Diana, co-author of Agile Retrospectives, a book that some of you may have read. I'm a consultant and author. My most recent book is 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. And I call on Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Tevis. I'm an independent coach and facilitator based out of Santa Barbara, California. And I partner with technical leaders who want to work as effectively with people as they do with technology. And I will call on Jay.
Hi, I'm Jay. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm currently a remote team coach at IO. And I'm the co-author of the Remote Facilitators Pocket Guide. I love finding ways to make remote spaces more human and engaging. So I'll call on Kirsten.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Clacey, also in Cape Town, South Africa. In fact, my bio is going to sound very similar to Jay's. I'm a team coach at IO too. And we co-authored the Remote Facilitators Pocket Guide and are spending our spare time working with companies to figure out what collaboration looks like in these new remote spaces. And I call on Molood.
The only one left. Hi, I am Molood Ceccarelli. I'm the founder of Remote Forever, and I am on a mission to bring remote work into Agile since a few years ago, and now it happens that most of you are working from home anyway. So I'm going to share my experiences with you. My background is in Agile coaching and software development.
Fantastic. So let's jump right in. Diana and Esther, in your book, Agile Retrospectives, Making Good Teams Great, you described a 5-phased approach to retrospectives. And the first of those phases is called Set the Stage. So how do you set the stage virtually? Esther, let's start with you. What are some of your favorite activities or ways to set the stage and open your retro with virtual teams?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that when you're remote, structure is much more important. I think you just have to have more structure. You have to think about your structure more, and you have to let people know where you are along the way. In this time, I think it's super important to do a check-in. I think, tell people what the structure is going to be, let them know how the call is going to flow, hold off on the details until you get to those steps, and then do a check-in. Because people have so much going on that just acknowledging that and bringing it into the space humanizes and just acknowledges the humanity of the people that are in the group.
So check-ins. So Diana, any advice on how to do a great check-in for setting the stage virtually?
Yeah, actually I've been sort of diving into that lately, various ways to do check-ins. I've asked people to pick a word from the nonviolent communication feelings and needs lists, like one feeling, one need. And we've done the core protocols check-in. We've done a check-in that is what's changed in your life since last week. I mean, there's a lot of simple ways you can get into that, but I agree with Esther, and I agree with Esther in that you need the structure. And I also think that you don't want to spend too much time here, because then people get restless. It's like, well, when are we getting to the meat of this? So it's kind of a fine discernment about giving enough time for people to get checked in, but not spending so much time on things like icebreakers and all kinds of other stuff that you might want to pack in there before you actually get into the work. People want to get into the work.
And I would say an icebreaker is very different from a check-in.
Yes. Yeah.
And skip the icebreakers.
Yeah.
So how so, Esther?
A check-in is people acknowledging what's going on for them, what their background is in terms of, what they're setting aside to be in this meeting, something about their feeling space, something about, where their head's at. And an icebreaker is typically constructed as a kind of getting to know you event. And, there are cases where they make sense. I don't think a retrospective is necessarily one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that we said in the retrospectives book is that the point of the check-in is to get all the voices. Part of the point of the check-in is to get all the voices in the room. Absolutely. So you do want something that gets people saying something right from the beginning. But it once you've accomplished that, move on into the work of the retrospective.
Yeah, one of the things that we've found is that if you get everyone in the room to participate early in the retrospective, it's more likely that they will participate again later in the retrospective. And that's one of the reasons why the check-in is such a useful activity. Yeah. Jay, what about you? What are some ways you like to set the stage virtually?
Yeah, so Esther mentioned preparation is important in the remote space. And I think Diana also mentioned like asking people to mention one word. But for remote meetings, I like to make it quite visual and engaging. So regardless of what tool I'm using, if I'm asking a question, it will be visual somewhere on the screen, and I'll make the space for people to engage in an interactive way. So if I'm asking for a word, I'll ask them to maybe write it first in a virtual sticky note before speaking it, just so that they have some time to think about things before speaking. But I also found, like recently with this Corona situation, I'm having to spend like slightly a little bit more time in the check-in phase. And that's just because people are coming in and the very first thing that they want to speak about is like, what is lockdown like for you? Or what is like the situation like where you live? Because we're all distributed around the globe, right? And I feel that if I just skip past that and go straight to the retro, I'm kind of just ignoring their feelings on the matter. And it's good to just give them a little bit of space to say like, this is what's going on for me. And then we can get down to business.
Okay, so let's say we ran a successful set the stage activity. The next phase in the 5-phased approach is gathering data. So how do we gather data in a virtual team? Maybe we'll start with Molood.
Asynchronously. Gathering data in all situations, not just retrospectives, in my opinion, should be asynchronous as much as possible. And not necessarily wait until an hour or a day before the retrospective to gather data, but instead create the framework that people need to pursue or follow through during the retrospective, and encourage them to input their data during the sprint, so that once you enter the retrospective, the data is already there and you can jump from your check-in to reviewing the data that has been gathered.
And what types of data do people like to collect, whether virtually or in person? What are some of the most impactful types of data? And anyone can take this one.
I think it really depends on what your focus is.
Yeah.
Right. You know, the data follows the focus. So for example, sometimes subjective data is exactly what you need. How do you feel we're doing on our technical practices? What is your perception of some practice, some event, something going on in the team? Sometimes that kind of data is pretty easy to gather within the retrospective. But if you're looking at quantitative data, I think, building on what Molood said, gather that ahead of time, right? So if you're looking at patterns of defects, you don't want someone's opinion on that. You want the data, and gathering that ahead of time, I think, is the only way to do it in an effective way. And then make it available to people ahead of time, because if you're trying to share it on a screen, I don't know how many other people do this, but I always find myself trying to scroll someone else's shared screen, because you're reading the data at a different pace than other people, or you might want to go back and forth. So gather it ahead of time, particularly with quantitative data, and then make it available ahead of time, so people are not just trying to absorb it off the screen in the moment.
Kirsten, what about you? What about gathering data in your experience? What do you like to do?
Something I was thinking of while Molood was speaking, I also like to allow space for asynchronous data gathering, both subjective and quantitative, but also bring space in the retrospective for people to still add to that in case they didn't have time, because a lot of people will, but a lot of people also won't. And the extra thing that I think asynchronous collaboration is quite a hot topic at the moment, and I'm sure there's a range of opinions. Some things I found useful is to be mindful that asynchronous collaboration still is helped along by facilitation. It probably just looks a little bit different. So just putting out some open-ended thing without any containers or constraints is also not helpful. So just because you're doing the data gathering via text asynchronously doesn't mean the role of the facilitator goes away. In fact, I think it's needed even more so to create a clear purpose, a way of engaging with the document, a time box, what's going to happen with that data, which is pretty much what a facilitator does in a space too. So I think when I think about data gathering asynchronously, I think of the role of a facilitator too. And then in the session, I think it's kind of been said already, but it needs to be visual. So making sure that people can see what we're talking about, as well as if there are links to maybe more longer data sets, allowing time for people to go through it. Because with it being a virtual thing, people are going to open those tabs on separate windows anyway and be scrolling through it. And rather than pretending they're not, just leaving 5-10 minutes silent reading time, acknowledge it's going to happen and create space for it.
So it sounds like there's a lot of preparation that needs to go into a successful retrospective, especially if it's distributed. I'm seeing a lot of head nods here. Yeah. So how much preparation do good facilitators really need to do ahead of the retrospective? How much of it is before and how much of it is facilitation during?
It depends.
Yeah, yes, it depends.
The ultimate
It
consultant's
depends
answer.
on a lot of factors. I mean, how many
Right.
people are in the meeting, what the topic is it controversial? Are you new to facilitation? So there are all sorts of things that go into it, but do it,
Yes.
right? It's not, it's not like you can just run it by the seat of your pants, particularly in a remote space. Where, and we came back to this in Kirsten's answer, structure, you need to be more explicit, you need to have more structure.
Yeah, and I find even now, with having run very, very many retrospectives, both in person and online, more in person ones, but even that, even now, I spend at least as much time preparing as I plan to spend in the retrospective. And in earlier days, I would double or triple that.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the kind of help that Kirsten and Molood were talking about, if you're gathering data ahead of time, then you're going to be actively, to some degree, actively managing that, making sure that people are contributing, encouraging them to contribute, setting it up so that they can. So all of that is part of the preparation for showing up in the formal retrospective. It's all a part of it. And then there may even be some follow-up after.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there's all this structure that we're putting into place to make the retrospective successful for our teams. There's an interesting question that we received that, the question, I'll quote it, what are some suggestions for a fun, mind-freeing remote retrospective?
Mm-hmm.
So Molood, do you have any thoughts there? How do you free your mind in a remote retrospective?
My mind is always free. No, I'm joking. I recently started working with a client, and I got like a lot of invitations in my calendar the first few days. And one of them was collective meditation. And I thought, wow, who would do that? So I just explored it and I attended it. And it turned out that it was a meditation followed by a company-wide retrospective, which was an amazing idea. So there was a guided meditation that they did there. Another thing that I would really like to do in a normal remote work setup, which, we're not bound to stay at home all day long, is actually going out for a walk and having a conversation that is the retrospective via our phone, which means there is no sharing of a screen, there is no visual, but there is only voice. And those are the type of retrospectives where you focus on emotions and you focus on happiness and you focus on the well-being of the psychological safety of the team, rather than focusing on the processes and the betterment of the product.
Yeah, so the idea of a group meditation, I think, will make some people excited and some people incredibly uncomfortable, right? Depending on personality
That's actually what
types.
happened to me. Yeah, I was very uncomfortable. I'm not the meditation in a group kind of person, but I did try it out for the experience. And what I got was that the meditation was just the check-in for the actual thing that was happening, which was let your mind be free. And we're going to talk about hard topics in this company.
Yeah, and the idea of including something like a group meditation is certainly a newer, more emergent approach to retrospectives than what you might have seen 15 years ago, for example. So Kirsten, as everything's changing right now, what are some of the things that you're seeing that you expect might be good practices or best practices or suggestions coming forward, things that are emerging right now that perhaps we didn't know 5 years ago?
Yeah, we've started touching on it, but something I've been thinking about a lot, especially the last few weeks, is how remote working, especially the pressure placed on it now, is calling into question a lot of the traditions that exist in how we work that we never thought to question, that we just inherited. And so that thing about finding ways to work asynchronously and synchronously, but just creating more balance in our lives. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that evolves. But more specifically, looking at emergent practices and remote retrospectives, I think co-creating artifacts and real-time documents is something that's shifting. So co-located retrospectives had a different way of capturing outcomes and engaging, whereas this thing of a group all real-time editing together and having these long living documents that capture entire conversations really quite powerful. When I started out in my career a long time ago, I was told journal and take notes of everything you see. And I was just thinking, if I could go back and have all the retrospectives that I'd ever attended documented, it would be super interesting from a learning perspective. So yeah, I think asynchronous ways of working, real-time documentation that lives forever, those are quite interesting to observe.
Great, and hopefully all of these ideas have one thing in common, which is that they help increase team participation in the retrospective. Paul, what are some ideas that you have in terms of how to increase the engagement in a retrospective, or making sure that everyone, regardless of personality, has a chance to contribute their voice?
Yeah. So one of the things, because I hear this a lot, not just in retrospectives, but in sort of all other types of meetings, right? Where people are like, how can we get people to engage more? And one of them is to actually ask them to do that. We've been talking about, we talked a lot about structure and about how you design an effective retrospective. And part of that is making sure that you're actually creating opportunities and inviting people to actually participate. And I think one of the things, pointing to what Kirsten was saying, is that there are some really great opportunities as we're working with digital tools to create opportunities for people to participate that they might not have otherwise. So for example, to circle back around to what we were talking about with check-ins, one of the things that I've been doing a bunch recently is I'll have a bunch of people, I'll ask sort of a check-in question, and I'll have all of them type their answers into the chat in whatever it is they're doing, but not hit return yet, right? Give it just, give them 60 seconds in silence, which for people like me seems like an eternity. And for a lot of people seems like way too short a time. We just all go on mute, everybody types out their answers, and then puts it all into the chat, and then actually go through the chat channel and have everyone just read aloud what they wrote. And so we can kind of hear from everybody, both from their fingers and also from their voices. But it really is not only just asking people to contribute, but creating an actual opportunity for them to do so. And I think it's things like that where we haven't always been good about planning those in our in-person retrospectives. And I think it's even more important now to think about how are we actually asking people to engage and to participate? And is our structure and our design actually asking them to do that? Or are we just looking to do something and move on?
Yeah, things like private brainstorming can help, right? It gives people time and space to come up with their ideas, record them down, and share them with the group very effectively. Jay, what about you? How do you increase team participation in your retrospectives?
So if we're speaking about synchronous retrospectives, and we're talking about increasing participation because we want to hear all voices, not because we have the school retro format and we want everyone to participate, I think that's a different distinction. So if I'm thinking about creating this equal opportunity for everyone to participate, I think it's kind of what Paul said. Am I thinking about the meeting in terms of how everyone is experiencing the meeting? So for example, if there's a room of people that are all together, maybe that's not happening right now because of COVID, and one person is remote, is that really effective for everybody involved? And just making sure that people can engage with in their own way. So for example, you'd often have people that speak a lot in the retrospective and people that are generally quiet. So making sure that you have different ways of engaging during the retrospective to make sure that you cover all of those bases. So giving people writing time, as Paul said, versus speaking time. And lastly, I think it's always good to just get feedback of your retrospective. So if you notice that you're not getting a lot of engagement, something as simple as asking the team, even just on a one-on-one basis, how you're doing, how they're experiencing your retrospective, they're probably the best people to give you feedback on what's going on or why they might not be participating.
I want to underscore something that Jay said right at the very beginning, or early on in her comment here, and that is the idea where a bunch of people are in a room and one person is remote. What we have found in the work that I've done with remote teams is that is like one of the worst possible situations. I mean, it's kind of doable. It's even worse if there is a group of people and 2 people remote in different places. That's almost impossible. And so either the best default is either everybody's in the room together or everybody is remote. Even if they are in the same location, they call into the meeting from their desk, from the different locations, because that levels the participation field.
It's designing for equal participation.
It's designing for equal participation, and it's critically important. You can kind of manage it with a group and one. It's not as good as if everyone is remote. And if you've got a few here, then it really starts falling apart. So I just wanted to highlight when she was talking about that is a really critically important thing to actually in your design think about where will people be sitting, and in what way will they call in to the meeting.
I would like to add something to that, and that is if you are in that situation and if you have no way around it, where one person is remote or 2 people are remote and everybody else is in the same room, one of the easiest things you can do is to have a physical indication of the person who is absent physically in the room. That is, you can put a laptop there and have their face on that laptop. That's like the cheapest, simplest way to make sure that that person is there. And also, like on equal participation, one of the main things you can do in situations like that is to do something like I'm doing over here, even though I'm not a facilitator, which is have all the names on a piece of paper next to you, and every time a person speaks, put a line next to their name so you can keep track of how much space people are taking, and you can give the space to the more quiet people.
Yeah, and one thing that we found effective in terms of boosting engagement is alternating how you ask people to participate. So for example, some people are very comfortable in a group setting like this, and they feel most comfortable speaking up in front of everyone in the team. And others feel much more comfortable in a one-on-one type session. And even within the retrospective itself, you can alternate between those formats. So for example, you can use 1, 2, 4 all from Liberating Structures, where you give people a chance to think for themselves about what they want to contribute, then pair up with somebody else to have a one-on-one discussion, and then move on to a 4-person discussion before finally bringing back the ideas to the broader group. And that can make sure that everyone has a chance to participate in a way that they feel most comfortable in participating. So let's imagine that we've broken that problem and we've fixed it, and now everyone's participating in the retrospective. Are we there yet, right? Or are there other issues, for example, with psychological safety and honesty and sharing what you really think, as opposed to contributing what you feel safe contributing to the conversation? Esther, let's start with you. How do you boost psychological safety in retrospectives?
Well, I think you can start by addressing what the current level of safety is. So sometimes I do a little safety survey, and then I ask what's one thing we can do that will make it more likely that you'll be able to speak up. Then we agree to that. So working agreements can contribute to it. But I think just acknowledging, that it is, that it is a thing, and finding out what the level of safety is tells you what you need to do, right? If you do a little safety survey and it turns out nobody is safe enough to talk about anything, then that's what you need to talk about, right?
And can you describe what a safety survey is for everyone on the call?
Yeah, when I've done them, I'll make a scale that says, I feel perfectly bring up any topic. Is the high 4, and a 0 is I'm keeping my head down. I'm not going to contribute anything. I'll just, I'll toe the company line. And then there's something in between. Like I feel safe to bring up certain topics, but not others. And that's putting that data together as a histogram and doing it anonymously gives the whole group a sense of where they are. And sometimes the fact that someone realizes I'm not the only one who feels unsafe actually raises the safety a little.
And I want to tag onto that because I use a very similar, unsurprisingly, because I probably learned it from Esther, technique. But then the other thing that I will do with that is, share that histogram and then make it clear So what do we want to do about that?
Right.
Right. That it's not just solely on me as the facilitator to address whatever that is. It's actually the collective responsibility of the group, which is also kind of modeling what the point of the retrospective is, which is to help the group figure out what it wants to do to improve, not to help the facilitator figure out what the facilitator wants to do to help the group improve. And so just kind of helping to model and build that muscle and make it the responsibility of the group. Once they've got the data to work with, now they can decide what they want to do about it.
Yeah, and I want to point out that the degree of psychological safety that is present or not present in a retrospective starts way before anybody shows up in the retrospective. And so that is a thing that if you want people to feel psychologically safe in your retrospective, you need to be working on that all the time. And if you're an outside facilitator coming in, then you need to be working with the folks who are your contacts with that team to help them do some of the things that we're going to make it a safer container. And if you're sitting with the team all the time, it's a thing that needs to be on your mind all the time. How safe are we here? And there are lots of tools online and things that you can find to sort of figure out the degree to that and help boost that. But because it's a big topic right now. But yeah, it's not a thing that is just about the retrospective.
I would also say that safety, psychological safety, doesn't mean you never feel uncomfortable. It means you feel like there won't be retribution if you bring up difficult topics, and you feel safe enough to be uncomfortable and bring up difficult topics. It doesn't mean that everything's always nice and everything's always happy and no one's ever ruffled in any way.
So go ahead, Kirsten.
Something I just wanted to add on there, which I think is specific also to remote retrospectives, and I found myself doing it. If you're in a co-located space and maybe something really nasty happens in a retrospective that breaks the safety, you kind of all walk back to your desks and you feel it and you have to deal with it, right? But in a remote space, the call ends and everyone's able to go back to their own invisible space. And it's so easy to hope that that thing will just, fix itself before next time. I hope it sorts itself out. And if you don't deal with it, it's not going to go away. So I think avoiding that desire to be hopeful and actually making the time to reach out to someone through cyberspace to solve things.
My chiropractor has a little sign in his office that says famous last words, maybe it will go away on its own. And that is just as true about emotional stuff as it is about physical stuff. And it has to do with attending to those things as they come up. Yeah.
May I add
laugh, because then I
additional
call.
tip?
Molood, please go ahead.
Okay, so I was also going to follow up on what Kirsten said about something that is specific to remote retrospectives, and that is also related to what Esther said earlier on about discomfort. That psychological safety does not necessarily mean that you're uncomfortable, and that is the fear of using tools. And I see that quite often, that a lot of people, especially in the generation before me, even though they have worked in software a lot longer than me, when it comes to using some of the modern tools, they might feel discomfort. So I think as a facilitator, one of the main things you can do in the very beginning of any meeting that you have, any retrospective that you have, is to give a quick introduction to the tool, and also to make it okay for people to fail while using that tool, and do not assume that everyone knows how the tool works. Like for those of you who are watching this webinar, maybe some of you have used Zoom before and maybe some of you haven't used Zoom before. So for those who are new to Zoom, if you look on the top right corner of your screen, you'll see a button that says Gallery View. And if you click it, you'll see all the faces in the same view. And if you click the button that appears there that's called the speaker view, you'll see one speaker in the large window covering your entire screen. Like simple instructions like that are necessary for a lot of people, just to give them a little more safety.
I don't think it has anything to do with age.
No, it does not, indeed. I'm sorry that I made it about it.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't have anything to do with age, indeed.
So let's say you run this safety check exercise and you discover that there's unfortunately a few people who have a lack of safety in the room. Diana, you mentioned how before the retrospective even starts, that's when you really need to work on the problem, not in the retrospective. Safety starts before the meeting.
Right.
How do you build psychological safety, especially today when we're all working from home and we can't physically be together?
Well, I think there are a lot of ways. And one of them, I was thinking about this earlier. I mean, we're talking about a retrospective as if it were this one event that happens once in a while that we prepare for. And as more and more of my friends and colleagues are moving to things like to various kinds of remoting, but definitely in mob programming, they're holding tiny little mini retros after every Pomodoro or after every couple of hours. You know, okay, what just happened? What do we want to, is there anything we want to call out? Is there anything we'd like to do differently in the next Pomodoro? And the more you're getting into that habit of it's okay to talk about stuff, it's okay to, you know, group learning is important to us. Turning, Woody Zuhl calls it, turning up the good is important to us. We want to keep getting better at everything that we're doing, and checking that on a really regular basis is one of the primary tools I see. And then also side channel, just checking in with each other personally, as a facilitator, as a scrum master, as a coach, making sure that you are also talking to folks, seeing how things are going for them, facilitating feedback interpersonal feedback between people that happens in a good way. I mean, there's just so many things like that you can be attending to that will help then when there is the larger retrospective where you're looking at a broader overview of a whole iteration or a whole release, then people come to that prepared to feel more comfortable about their participation. So it's a continuous learning thing. And so all the little tools that you can use that really are about not incremental learning, but continuous learning make a big difference.
Yeah, sometimes there are things that are unsafe for some people in the team, but safe for others on the team. And so, for example, if I have 4 kids, and it's entirely possible that one of them will run into my room at any time right now. And I feel safe about that. I actually would love that to happen because I think it would demonstrate that that's okay and that's acceptable, and people should feel comfortable with that type of situation happening because of what's going on in the world right now. So one way that I've used to help build psychological safety is if you find someone who does feel comfortable about that issue, to then intentionally become vulnerable about it and demonstrate that it's okay to you, because it can help bring up the levels of safety for other people on the team about that particular issue. What else about building safety for remote teams right now? Open it up to the panel.
I kind of got 2 things. One of them is to kind of springboard off of what you were just saying, David. And I think it's actually important as a facilitator, like recognizing that you're in a position of authority. And to then model like the vulnerability and the admission of mistakes and being transparent about when things go wrong. Like, it's actually sometimes really important not to be too perfect as a facilitator. That's what I tell myself all the time. That's my explanation for why I let things go wrong. But there is a degree to that if you're exhibiting that behavior and you're admitting things that are scary for you and you're admitting things that are dangerous, right? That is one of the ways that people can see that it can be okay to do that. The other thing about, like, fundamentally, psychological safety is about building the trust that it is worth it for people to bring up difficult issues, problems. And the best way to do that is to demonstrate that they actually get addressed. Right? And so to point back to what Diana was saying, like, one of the things where I see people lose faith in retrospectives is the fact that all these kinds of things come up and then nothing happens, right? We try to take on too much, nothing gets done, and so people stop bringing things up. And I don't blame them for that. Like, it's a perfectly reasonable response to that. So I think that fundamentally, one of the things you can do to make it safe to bring up problems is to actually address problems that get brought up.
So that's a good interlude into follow-through on retrospective action items. This is, in my experience, the most common pain point that people have. Even if you facilitate a well-oiled machine in the retrospective itself, if nothing changes, you kind of just wasted your time to a certain extent. So how do we encourage follow-through in general? And is there anything specific for remote teams on follow-through that you all can offer?
I don't mind answering this. For me, I try to make sure that the follow-through is not for the facilitator, that the follow-through is for the team. So when they're getting to this place where they're speaking about what they can do and what they can do next, it's important to move the conversation so that it's very team-based. So it's not like, Jay, I think you need to change this retrospective time in the calendar to be something else. It has to be something that the team owns together, so that when you're checking up on it in the next retro and you're finding out why this hasn't worked, you make sure that it's a team-based activity. And the second thing that I want to say was also just making sure that that action item or whatever follow-through you've decided on as a team is made visible, so that everybody agrees to what was said. Because oftentimes and I'm speaking, synchronously, oftentimes if you're speaking in a meeting and there's so much conversations flying around, different people have different images of what that item was that you decided on. So just making sure that it's visible.
Well, I think there's a big organizational component to this. If there is enormous pressure to deliver whatever it is you're making, features or whatever, and improvement is not part of the plan, if it's like, oh, that's other work over there, right? If it's not considered part of your real work, it's going to get pushed out. And I see so many organizations where the managers encourage retrospectives. Sometimes they require retrospectives, but people aren't given any time to think and learn and try something new and experiment. So I think from the standpoint of the organization, having that be coherent is helpful. When it's not, it just leads to cynicism. The other thing I think is helpful is to do the smallest possible thing, right? Very, very often I see teams take on, some big systemic issue or 42 items or, one tiny thing, a tiny thing. And if it's something that's going to take weeks, see if you can reframe it so that it'll take days. If it takes days, see if you can get it something that's hours, so that people are able to take some action, see some result, get some feedback, and begin to realize they have agency.
What else? Does anyone else want to add anything about action items and follow through? Because I know this is a huge pain point for a lot of teams.
Well, I think I'll jump in, but I actually want to hear from Kirsten and Molood too about this. But the one thing that it has to do is actually having action items, and not just having, here's a list of the things we thought went well, here are the things we'd like to appreciate in other people, here are the things that didn't go so well, okay, now we're done with the retrospective. And then we end up with, the outcome of the retrospective is lists. It's not actions. It's not plans to make it. It's not deciding to do something. Mm-hmm. And that is more than anything else, that is the anti-pattern that I see that makes retrospectives useless. They're just a big waste of time at that point. I mean, there's some sort of sharing of state of mind, but beyond that, they don't contribute anything back to improving the work, which is their intention. So you can go out to happy hour or have a virtual happy hour if you just want to connect with each other. So don't call that a retrospective, right?
I would say an action item isn't always we're going to fix X, Y, or Z. It can be we're going to do an experiment. We're going to learn about something. It might be we're going to, we're going to watch some videos about the mod programming so we can learn about it. So it doesn't have to be we will fix. It can be we will learn, we will experiment, we will influence.
Yeah.
So it can be a lot of things, but it needs to be something.
Yeah, especially for teams that struggle with finding consensus around what to work on next. Decreasing the barrier to entry from action to hypothesis can help people remove their resistance. Right? So instead of, well, I don't think that's the best idea, so I'm going to argue against it. It's a hypothesis. Nobody really knows. Let's try and see what happens. That can be very beneficial to the team. Kirsten, Molood, what about one of you? Any ideas on increasing follow-through?
Go for it, Molood.
Go. You go.
Okay.
No, you go.
A group of facilitators. The two things that came to mind for me were quite practical things. So the one is around creating continuity. So if you end a retrospective at a certain place and you have maybe a Google slide or whatever, something as simple as copy pasting that to the next one so that it's physically there and easy to find. And maybe even if it was a thing that hasn't been spoken about much, doing a check-in question on last retro's actions. So put a green, red, or amber dot if you think we need to continue or not continue speaking about it, or something light like that. So the first thing for me there is continuity. And then the second thing is probably even more simple and practical, is when you've just had a conversation, all those networks in your brain are kind of really freshly activated. And if you can reinforce it again, those maps are a little bit more likely to stick. And so what I like to do is something super simple, but it's just send a screenshot of whatever the last slide actions were. And it's kind of the same as taking a photo of a board and sending it on a channel or leaving the board up, but it just kind of amplifies what was achieved and sends a little path around those networks again. So it's just one level stuck there, if that makes sense.
And switching gears a little bit here from follow through back to engagement in the retrospective itself. And one of the pain points that I'm hearing a lot about, given that we're all calling in on Zoom these days, is video, no video. How do you create engagement when maybe some people feel comfortable with video, some people don't? Molood, what are your tips there?
I would say, first of all, know before the retrospective whether or not people are going to have video or not, and design your retrospective accordingly. And always be prepared that technology is not going to work. So just like when you design a workshop, you think about different ways of how people learn. Like some people are auditory, some people are more tactile, some people are more visual. You think about that if you're a good facilitator. And it's the same when you want to facilitate a retrospective where people don't have equal amounts of bandwidth for communication. So you see, when I say bandwidth, I'm not talking about internet bandwidth, obviously. I'm talking about communication bandwidth. That is, if you have face-to-face, if you can see the person and hear them and even smell them, that's a much bigger bandwidth than if you can only hear them, because you're losing a lot of those visual cues. So some of the things you can do is to make sure that you probe more frequently from those people who are not on video, because as you see here on this screen, if you're watching this on a screen, you can actually see a lot of us nod in agreement to the other person. But how are you going to capture that nod from those non-video participants? You need to ask a question, have them write in the chat box or unmute themselves and say yes, and do that very, very frequently, and make sure that people are, first of all, heard with the tip I gave you before, and make sure that they get the voice. Like, I would really like David to ask Jay to speak a little more. And also make sure that you use the different ways that people are attending already.
I'll use that prompt. So Jay, you're now in the hotspot. Who decides whether video should be on?
I think I can speak on behalf of Kirsten with this too, but we feel quite strongly about not forcing people to switch on their video. And I would say, especially in this time where everybody's forced to work from home and they might not have a remote work setup, we're kind of speaking to safety now. If you're forcing people to switch their video on and they're not totally comfortable with their background, or they might have a kid on their lap or a lovely little cat, whatever it might be, you kind of intruding into their home life. And so I would personally just not force anyone to switch on their video just because you don't know what the circumstances are. And as Molood said, there are ways that you can design your session to make sure I don't want to say make sure, to encourage people to give feedback. So whether that might be in a written form or verbal, either which way, there are ways to sort of get a response from people without seeing them physically. So yeah, I feel quite strongly, yes.
I want to emphasize that as being voluntary, because there is actually advice out there from, you know, various corporate entities. I'm editing myself just a tiny bit there. That says force people to have video because then they can't hide. Then they can't be, you know, looking at their email or doing something else. And so people have internalized that, right? If you force video, people very, very often experience it as surveillance. You're doing that so that you can see what I'm up to because you don't trust that I'm actually going to be engaged. So yeah, voluntary.
So there's a lot of different facilitation techniques, activities, games that you can find in your book, Diana and Esther, as well as online in various sources. Are these possible today with remote teams? And if so, which ones, I'm opening this up to anyone who wants to respond in the panel, which ones work the best for a distributed team?
It depends. Someone else take it over.
Well, I actually think Jay and Kirsten have done a lot of work on making exercises work in a remote space. So.
Okay. So I think Jay and I a while ago got really curious about what's the same and what's different in a virtual space, because you don't want to overemphasize the differences because people are still people and teams are still teams, but at the same time, it is kind of different. Working with people like this doesn't feel the same. My body doesn't respond the same way to you because we're not physically together. You know, there's differences. So I think, I mean, it's a very deep question, but I would probably almost go out on a limb and say everything that's co-located can in some way, the essence of it or wisdom of it can be transcribed virtually. It just takes a lot more thought. You need to kind of almost codify the behaviors and reconstruct them virtually while acknowledging the constraints and benefits of the medium. So there are some benefits in making sure you're leveraging those while also really designing to fill the gaps.
So I'm going to push the panel a little bit here. And Jay, I want to ask you, and then I'm going to go to each person also, to actually pick one activity or technique or game that you recommend that works for remote teams and that you want to share today with everyone on the webinar. So a activity that has worked before for you in remote settings.
Do you mean for a retrospective? This is such a hard question because I don't want to say it depends, but it really does. I don't have like a favorite. Do you mean just?
Yep, so it doesn't have to be a favorite. I'm happy to come back. Maybe Esther, let's go to you. So which activity that you have used do you find to be effective for remote teams?
I think you can do a lot with sticky walls. So anything about brainstorming and grouping. If you have access to Jamboard or one of the paid tools, you can recreate that sort of brainstorming and affinity grouping. I mean, that's really an easy one.
Yeah, so these are things like Mad, Sad, Glad, and Lean Coffee, perhaps. Any sort of brainstorming with sticky notes.
Brainstorming about what factors contribute to the issue, brainstorming about what we might do to shift one of those factors. So it's not limited to Mad, Sad, Glad. You could be brainstorming out what experiments we might do and then affinity group them.
Paul, let's go to you. What activities, games do you use for remote retros?
So it's been interesting for me as I've been shifting from doing a lot of stuff in person to working online. I'm actually a very verbal person, right? Words are my stock in trade. And what I've been actually finding more is shifting more to doing stuff visually and just in an analog fashion, right? Actually asking people to draw stuff, giving them time to get out of the words. And so there's an activity called Drawing Together that I like to do. Which is where you ask people to sort of describe what it is that they're experiencing. You ask them a question, you give them a prompt, and it's a very limited, simple visual vocabulary you ask them to draw it with, and then they interpret each other's drawings. And it's not about getting it right. And I find that shifts, and part of it right now is just the slowdown, right? Of like, let's stop having to try to do everything in 5 minutes. Let's acknowledge that what's happening in the world is not the usual. This is not working from home, right? This is being at home during a crisis and trying to get work done. And so right now, I'm really loving things that are allowing us to sort of slow down and engage the visual. And so that even if people don't have a video camera on, right, they can take a picture and upload it to your to whatever tool it is that you're using, things like that.
Diana, what about you?
Well, my favorite thing is always the very last thing I've learned, because I'm still playing with it and still experimenting with it. And I was on a call yesterday where the facilitator said, if you have had this experience, and it could have been this experience during the iteration, take a sticky note and put it over your camera. And the interesting thing, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. People have sticky notes around their desks, you know. But what was interesting was with a number of people on the screen, all this color started popping up. So there was green, there was blue, there was red, and it was just for a moment, just to get a sense of who all had done that thing or who all had experienced that thing. But it was it would require people to be on video, but it was very effective, and it added a completely different element to kind of the other things that we normally do. And so that's what I'm experimenting with now, and it's my new favorite until tomorrow when I learn another new favorite.
We'll have to bring you back onto another webinar then, Diana.
Yeah.
I'm the same way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kirsten, what about you?
Something I'm really enjoying when you kind of get to that tipping point of we've got an action, but we're evaluating if this is something we want to commit to, but you also don't want to have another 45-minute discussion of everyone going all over, is all the visual ways you can display opinion, and specifically deciding maybe 2 variables. So maybe impact and effort, and giving everyone a sticky and putting it somewhere there. That could have been a 30-minute discussion, which you still end with not knowing where people stand. Whereas in 30 seconds, you've got this really vivid visual that tells you something, and then the group can work with that data. So, yeah.
Molood?
Last one again. That's good. That's good. You're doing good, David. I was... gosh, it was just in my head. I was thinking about something else that I did in the chat. So don't do that. Don't chat and talk on a panel at the same time. So one of the things that I like to take away is because I work with a lot of corporations, and they deal with a lot of limitations and restrictions regarding security, regarding the choice of tools and all of that. One of the things that I'd like to emphasize is using the tools that you have at your disposal in order to achieve the goal that you want to achieve. Say, like, if you are not allowed to use Retrium in your organization for any reason, you have Jira, you can use Jira for running a retrospective. It's not impossible to use the tools that you already have. So just get creative and get back to the roots and the purpose of what it is that you're trying to do.
Fantastic. And Jay, did you want to add anything, or thumbs up, you're good to go?
I thought of something. I really like adding lots of fun to my retrospectives, and fun doesn't have to mean not business or not serious. Fun just means like you inviting people to play in the space. And so what I really like to do is add some images wherever I can, One example is I can pretend we're all on a pirate ship, and so the retro activity would be to find an iceberg that we might knock into, or what is anchoring us down, or what is winding our sails, or for example, and just adding images to represent this picture that I'm painting can be quite useful for people to make sense of the space and what I'm really asking. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it looks to me like we are 60 minutes into this webinar. I want to thank everybody who attended today for taking the time out of your busy, stressful lives right now. I want to thank all of the panelists who are here today, Kirsten, Jay, Esther, Paul, Diana, and Molood. All of you had some fantastic insights, and I hope that everyone learned at least one thing that you can take back to improve your retrospectives right away. So thank you, everybody. We'll make the recording available as soon as we can. Bye. Stay safe.
Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
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 Bye.